now we will turn to our speaker, Anne Wright. I want to start, I was just starting to look at her book, Descent, and there's a great quote from Daniel Ellsberg. Who wrote the foreword. It says, if you're at all like me, you will have a whole set of new heroes when you finish reading this. And Anne is one of the heroes of our country, really. She worked as a colonel in the army and as a diplomat for more than 35 years. She resigned on March 19th, 2003, the day before we began bombing in Iraq. And she showed great moral courage then and continues now. And we need this kind of leadership in our country. One way I got to know her was because of her work on environmental issues in the state, military-related environmental issues in her home state of Hawaii, where the local community around the Red Hill military fuel depot have suffered because of leaking of fuel from the World War II era fuel tanks. That was of great interest to me because we have even more, I think, fuel tanks, World War II era fuel tanks at the Manchester Fuel Depot here, not far away from where we are right now. And so many of us are very concerned about the environmental impacts of those old fuel tanks that are located on a seismic fault zone and right by the water in our beautiful Pacific Northwest. So one of the things that impresses me is that even though she's traveling all over the world doing all this activism with Veterans for Peace and Code Pink, she still has time to put out this daily newsletter. A daily newsletter, like talking about all the activities that local activists are doing. And it includes like all kinds of pickets and meetings and relevant news articles. I just think it's very impressive. So anyway, I wanted to give a shout out for doing that, because that's the kind of slog, that's the kind of like activist slogging that we need, I think, that many of us are used to doing. So anyway, given this critical moment with all these tensions in the world, both between conflict and environmental issues, I'm pleased to invite Anne as our key speaker. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Kathy, and it's great to be here at Ground Zero. My goodness, I've heard about this place for a long time, and it's great to be here, and thanks to Kit and Keith for putting me up at their lovely home now, and to see a lot of old friends that are here. It's really great to see people from all over the Northwest that are here, and we certainly want to welcome our friends from the Marshall Islands who will be telling us a lot about the effects of nuclear weapons, which is really the key thing that we're talking about here in this annual gathering that we have around the weekend of Hiroshima-Nagasaki. And Kathy, thank you very much for the leadership that you have for Ground Zero. We have a Hawaii Peace and Justice organization in Honolulu, where I live. I live in Honolulu because when I resigned from the government 20 years ago over the Iraq War, I was living in Mongolia, and it was 40 below zero in Mongolia. and I was cold as could be. Every morning I was getting up writing more things about why I was so distressed about what the U.S. government was about to do to attack, invade, occupy Iraq. That I was getting up every morning writing more things, and finally I came to the point that I resigned from the government, and I was one of 3 U.S. diplomats that resigned. That was after being in the diplomatic corps for 16 years. I served in a lot of places where I may have seen you all outside the U.S. Embassy protesting U.S. policies in Nicaragua, Grenada, Somalia, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Sierra Leone, Micronesia, right down the road from our Marshall Islands friends. I helped reopen the embassy in Afghanistan in January of 2001, and then went on to what ultimately became my last assignment, which was as the Deputy Ambassador at the U.S. Embassy in Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia. So it was freezing cold there, and the first thing the State Department sent back to me after I'd resigned was, "Where do we send your stuff?" It wasn't like, "Oh, we're so sorry that you don't agree with us," or da-da-da-da. It's just like, "Oh, get out of here. We don't need your criticism. Get on out, and where do we send your stuff?" So I said, well, I want to get warm, and it was Hawaii. And I've been being in Hawaii ever since. And Kathy mentioned, we've got a lot of social justice issues in Hawaii. It's one of the most militarized places in the whole world. On the island that I live on, Oahu, we have 4 major military bases. We have submarines that are coming in all the time, and of course the U.S. government doesn't tell us whether they have nuclear weapons on or if they are still storing nuclear weapons in Hawaii. There is a suspicion that probably they are. Having resigned from the government, and that was after 29 years actually in the U.S. military, 16 on active duty and 13 in the reserves. And a shout out to all of us who are part of Veterans for Peace or veterans that are sitting here today. How many vets do we have? Well, and trying to get word to our dear friends who are still in the military to say there are a lot of people that are challenging what policies our elected officials have on how our communities operate, and operate in the whole issue of militarization of our societies in so many different ways. So, whenever you run into a military guy or gal, chat them up, talk to them about what's happening. And I think you might be a little surprised at some of the positive vibes you get back from them. Well, what I'm going to talk about today is kind of going through a series of events. And as Kathy mentioned, I do a lot of speaking around the world, and it's because of the background that we have coming out of the government. A lot of people want to hear our version of what the current status is of our government policies. And even though it was 20 years ago, was the last time I was in the government. How long have you been retired?
25.
Oh, 25, yeah. But still, I mean, what we saw Tom explaining to us, it's important that people that have had this background are here speaking. And that's why I'm looking forward to our friends from the Marshall Islands and what they have to say, because they've been through it all. And so today we thank you very much for Ground Zero hosting this annual get-together. It's the first time I've been to Ground Zero, although I've heard about this place forever. So thank you for the kind invitation to be here. While we are here, it's the August 5th here, but it's already August 6th in Japan. And in Japan, the commemoration of Hiroshima, August 6th, the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima, those meetings are going on right now. In fact, how many of you all have ever been to Hiroshima or Nagasaki for the events, the commemorations? They're very, very emotional, and I put a couple of slides up here. This one on the right is for this evening, where they'll be floating the lanterns for all of those that were killed in Hiroshima. Over on the left is a reminder, that people in Japan remember what happened to them, and there certainly is a large movement to say no more war. Even though the United States is continuing putting pressure on the Japanese government to throw out their peace constitution, their constitution that says that they will not be a part of any aggressive, offensive military actions, that their self-defense force will not be using any weapons in an offensive nature. But that's going down the tubes fast as the U.S. keeps putting pressure on Japan and on Australia and on New Zealand and South Korea to be the partners in NATO. and NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, but now it's the Pacific. And other things, organizations that we've worked with, and you all up here have been the host to our Veterans for Peace historic anti-nuke sailboat called the Golden Rule. How many of you all have been a part of that? Yay! And I would like to acknowledge that Captain Tom Rogers was on the Golden Rule in 2019, and here we have a picture of him right back there. He is. He was on the Golden Rule. How many days did it take you all to get over?
21 days.
21 days to go.
21 horrible days.
21 horrible days. Well, let me just say it wasn't as horrible as the gang that brought the boat back 2 years later. In 2021, it took them 29 days to get back. And as they said, when we met them in Sausalito, they came into Sausalito, and we were on the phone with them, as they got in phone contact, and it was like, well, what can we do for you? Oh, well, we want real coffee, we want a pizza, and we want a warm shower because we had been cold ever since we left Honolulu 29 days ago. We were wet and cold. So we thank Tom, and then let's see, Ed, you've been a part of the Golden Rule in the last couple of weeks, haven't you?
Last couple of months.
The last couple of months. He's been doing filming for the Golden Rule as it, well, before I tell more of your story, this banner, Make Hawaii and the Pacific Nuclear Free, that is a 50-year-old banner that was used 50 years ago in Honolulu, and Jim Albertini, who's one of the big peace activists on the Big Island, he dragged that out of his basement and brought it out so that our anti-nuke sailboat could have it right on there as they arrived in August, was it 2nd of 2019? It was this week. Yeah. So we thank them very much. And that Golden Rule, which is the Veterans for Peace National Project, has, well, a couple of more pictures. There we go, Tom. See that? With the little lei and then several members of the crew. You look awfully young there. That beard. Oh, yeah. So we have Helen Jacquard is the project manager. She's been the manager of that boat for now 7 years. And it has really done a lot of educational events. While the boat was in Honolulu, or in the islands of Hawaii, we went to all of them but one. Over 100 educational events on the importance of our community, putting pressure on our elected officials to say we don't want nuclear weapons. And we were able in Honolulu to get a city resolution saying no more nuclear weapons. I don't know that they would pass it now, but they did then. The Golden Rule has embarked on another major trip, and it is what's called the Great Loop. And we trucked the boat from the West Coast after it got back from Hawaii. We put it on a truck and took it up around the Minneapolis area, and it's been coming down the Mississippi River, having educational events all the way down, and one of the most important events and the most, where the community got behind it the most was in Des Moines, Iowa, where there is a large Marshallese community, and they greeted the Golden Rule with all sorts of wonderful community events. So we were really thrilled with that. Then we had, because the Mississippi at the time was without water in many places, or so little water that commercial traffic couldn't go down the river. So we had to divert over to the Tennessee River and then come down to the Gulf Coast, down the west coast of Florida, educational events all the way. And then over January 1st, I went down to Cuba. And that was really, really fascinating to get the permission to bring the boat down in Havana. And then the crew and others made a trip down to Cuba and had a remarkable time with the Cuban community. Then back up the East Coast, and then Ed, you joined them where? In Washington, D.C.? Mm-hmm. So events all the way up the coast, and then here's a picture over on this side, right, of the Golden Rule and the Statue of Liberty behind it, and that was, I believe, during the 4th of July weekend. Well, the boat now is on the way. It's already been up. Let's see, it's gone this way, then it's come back, and it's going into the Great Lakes, and will eventually get to Chicago, where we will take her out of the water again and truck her back to the West Coast. And everybody will take a little breather. The little boat will get to breathe for a while. It's only 38 feet long. It's a tiny, really. How tiny is it, Tom?
It's a lot tinier than 38 feet, because 38 feet is from the very tip of the bow to the very end of the rudder. And it's a lot smaller. And oh, by the way, it's wooden, it's heavy, it's unstable in any kind of waves. And I'm done talking.
But every single person that's been on it says they would love to go back on it again. Yeah. Right?
On a river.
On a river. Yeah. And probably it would take 20 of these to be as the length of one nuclear submarine. If it's 600 feet,
right, sure.
20 of the size of that little boat right there. Anyway, I just wanted to let you all know, because the Golden Rule has been up here in the Northwest many, many times, and we anticipate that she will be coming back up here again, and we look forward to your welcoming her again.
Yeah.
Yes.
In 2016, Golden Rule led a flotilla of ships, sailboats, and kayaks and power boats down the Hood Canal, and did the first waterborne blockade of the Bangor submarine base since 1980. And we were accompanied by no less than 2 Coast Guard cutters, 6 Navy security boats, and 1 Kitsap County Sheriff boat.
Well, let's do it again then. Wow. Thank you for that history. Wow. Well, I'm going to go from the Golden Rule on to some other things. And I just have come back from 5 weeks in Europe. And I want to go through some of these places where I was very fortunate to get to go to conferences and speak at conferences. The first one was the International Summit for Peace in Ukraine. And why am I bringing it up? Well, it's the current war. The current war that the U.S. and NATO are a part of, even though they keep saying, no, we're not really. You all probably know the history of how this has all come about. I won't go into that. What I want to talk about, though, is that we had over 300 people that came to Vienna, Austria, to talk about peace. And how do you get warring parties to stop killing each other? My role in it was to talk about the history of ceasefires. And, you know, that's the way the end of wars start, is you talk about how do you end killing each other. In the Korean War, which was 70 years ago, a 3-year war, the negotiations to end the war started at the end of year 1 and continued for 2 more years. 575 meetings took place between Koreans, North, South, U.S., China. It was 2 years it took to get the ceasefire, and in that period of time, millions of Koreans were killed. Millions of them. They estimate 4 million. 500,000 Chinese were killed, and 33,000 U.S. and about 5,000 UN forces. So all the time people were talking about ending the war, but people kept getting killed and killed. The Vietnam War started, 15-year war. The negotiations started in 1968. They ended in 1975, and during that time, millions of Vietnamese, North and South Vietnamese. We had 55,000 U.S. We had another 20,000 of other Allied forces that were killed while the talks were going on. So the point of this conference, which was not pro-Ukrainian, not pro-Russian, it was just let's get this thing done, was, how do we get parties together to talk? And there was no ultimate resolution on how you do it. We do know since this, the African nations have tried to get the warring parties together. That didn't work. That was a week and a half ago. The Saudi Arabians are on it now, trying to get both parties to come together and start talking. And we should be encouraging our government to not stand in the way, which it has done in the past, and stand in the way of any sort of negotiations. So this was very interesting, with 300 people from primarily all over Europe and borderline countries with Russia, Poland, Lithuania, Finland, Sweden. People there saying, we are showing the effects of this war in our societies, and we want it to end. So that was a very interesting thing. Then another event that just has happened was on another part of the world, the 70-year war that still officially is going on the Korean Peninsula, because we don't have a peace agreement. It's only an armistice that was signed in 1953. And so we mobilized about 400 people, came to Washington, D.C. to be a part of the national mobilization to say, we want our government to push for discussions with North Korea, with China, with all of the parties of that war, and let's come to an agreement so that the North Koreans don't feel like they are being threatened by the United States. And that's what they feel. They feel the United States is trying to overthrow their government. And when we have the largest ground exercises since the end of the Cold War have gone on in the last 2 months in South Korea, right along the demilitarized zone, when we have B-52s that are flying right along the demilitarized zone right now, when the first time in 40 years we put a nuclear submarine into one of the ports of South Korea. It doesn't really give the North Koreans any trust in us not having a policy of regime change. I was in North Korea. Have any of you all been to North Korea? Every now and then there's a hand that pops up and it's like, how did you get there? Why were you there? Well, I went with 30 international women from 15 countries, 2 Nobel Peace Laureates, with what was called Women Cross the DMZ. And this was in 2015. We talked with North Korean women, 250 of them, that were selected by the North Korean government, no doubt about that, but they told us what the effects of the 3-year war in Korea still had on them 70 years later. 70 years later. Then we went across the DMZ, only the 3rd civilian group ever allowed to cross the DMZ into South Korea, and met with 400 South Korean women who talked about the effects of the Korean War still on them, and the divided families, the families in South Korea that have family in North Korea, and the Korean Americans here in the United States, that have family members of their North Korea. The U.S. has a travel ban on us going to North Korea now. It happened during the Trump administration, and that was when a young American, Otto Warmbier, went to North Korea on a beer tour. There's an overnight train from Beijing that takes tourists up to North Korea, and he was on one of those, and apparently during the course of this, he went into a hotel and started ripping down some posters, and that is something you don't do in North Korea. You don't rip up stuff. And so he was arrested, and tragically, he ended up suffering something, and he ended up dying just as soon as he was released here. A terrible, horrible thing. But from that, the Trump administration said, okay, no more Americans going there unless you get a special validation passport from the State Department. And the only ones that have been issued in the past 2.5, 3 years have been for just a very few non-governmental organizations that have had long-term programs in North Korea. Did you know the Quakers, the American Friends Service Committee, have had agricultural programs in North Korea for 35 years. The Mennonites have had agricultural programs in North Korea, and these are very important programs. It's important for us as American citizens to go to places where our country does not want us to go. We need to see why it is that the U.S. government says you should not go to Cuba, you should not go to Iran, you shouldn't go to Yemen, you shouldn't go to North Korea. We need to go there and see what the impact of U.S. sanctions and U.S. policies have been on these. So we do have a program that's coming out of this Korea Peace Now, which is to lift the travel ban, to help divided families get to travel to see their loved ones in North Korea, and for North Koreans to be able to come here. Until this travel ban, we have had North Korean students that have been students in American universities. Not a lot of them, but some. And we need this cultural interchange for the safety and security of our own world. And it's not just a mobilization for peace in the Korean Peninsula that we did in Washington, but at the same time in Korea. The picture over here is of South Koreans who went to all of the military bases in South Korea and had encircled the bases to say, we want peace. We don't want the continued militarization of our peninsula. Okay, and then as a part of this mobilization, we had a one-day conference in Washington, and two of the most interesting speakers were a retired Lieutenant General of the Air Force, Dan Leaf, who was the Deputy Commander of the Pacific Command. After he retired from the Air Force, he wrote an article about the need to look at a different perspective on Korea, on issues of the Korean Peninsula. And this essay that he wrote got an international award. Well, I had never heard of this. A Lieutenant General writing something like this. It wasn't until he got in touch with Christine Ahn, who also lives in Honolulu, who is the Executive Director of Women Across the DMZ, the group that organized us to go to North Korea and then South Korea. He got in touch with Christine to say, I just read about you in the newspaper and you're working for peace on the Korean Peninsula, and I think I am too. And it was like, a Lieutenant General doing this? And so they met and started talking, and she said, well, if you're really interested, we would love to have your interest in this publicized. Would you consider writing an opinion piece for a newspaper about your essay and why you've changed kind of your mind on what U.S. policies on the Korean Peninsula should be? And he went, well, I guess so. Well, his essay came out in the New York Times. And so we've kind of, like, Tom and I is kind of, he's a captain in the Navy, I was a colonel in the Army, and for years we were kind of the highest ranking military that have been in Vets for Peace and, speaking out like this, and then finally we get a general. A general that's on our side. Yeah. So Dan came to the conference, and his point, as I've mentioned here, nuclear war is only one mistake away. He, as a person who has had all sorts of experience with nuclear weapons with the Air Force, of flying nuclear weapons around and housing them on Air Force bases and stuff like that, he is very clear. He said, we are so close to a mistake that could just be the horrific mistake of the century. The other person on the panel was Siegfried Hecker, who is the American who has spent, the only American who has ever been in the North Korean nuclear facilities. He was the head of Los Alamos. And the North Koreans, back in the days when there was actually discussions going on between North Korea and the U.S., they invited him to come see the nuclear facilities. At that time, they had not developed nuclear weapons. And he has written a book about he calls the hinge points, the places where there was an opportunity that the U.S. and North Korea could have resolved some issues, starting back in the Clinton administration. It's a book that will just tear your heart apart, because there is no reason for us to be having the confrontations we're having now. There are opportunities that these two countries, our country and North Korea and others, can get together if the politicians will just let it happen. And that's the problem. We've got warmongering politicians in both parties. So this was a really, really important collection of people. We haven't posted yet the recording of this panel, but it should be coming up the next week or so. And I'll be glad to send the link to you all, because it's really interesting to hear these two guys speak. Another event that I went to was actually back in Europe for the No to NATO. Every year when NATO has its summit, whether it is in Warsaw, Poland, whether last year it was Madrid, Spain, this year it was in Lithuania, but we didn't have any peace groups in Lithuania that could kind of host a group of internationals to come and be there as the heads of the NATO countries have their summit. So we decided we would go to the headquarters of NATO, which is in Brussels, and a new group called Global Women for Peace, United Against NATO, formed up just 6 months ago. Women that I never even run into, and all of the times I've been at events in Europe and other places, a whole new group of people that said, I want to work on stopping NATO's aggressive actions that are jeopardizing the security of the whole world. So we had about 45 women that were actually in Brussels, but then we had webinars that were coming from all over the world with women that were concerned about NATO actions in their part of the world. Next year, we want to invite all of you all to come to Washington, D.C., because that's where the 75th anniversary of NATO is going to be held. The NATO summit will be in July. Yeah, there we go. There's a guy that's coming. I can tell by his reaction. July 9th through 11th will be the actual summit in Washington, D.C. We don't know where they're going to have it yet. And the weekend preceding it is the July 4th weekend, which is, it's going to be a challenge for us to get people there, 4th of July and all that stuff. What's going to happen, though, is we're going to have, of course, a rally at the White House, No to NATO. We'll have a march somewhere in Washington, and we'll have a conference. And we'll have speakers from all over the NATO countries. So put this on your plan for July, and we'll be getting back with you with the actual timing of it, and hope that you can come. Okay, so while we mentioned just a minute ago that in Hiroshima and Nagasaki right now, there are events that will be going on to commemorate the dropping of the bombs there. In Europe right now, there are activists that are going to some of the nuclear bases to have demonstrations there. And one is at Vogel in the Netherlands, and you can see here, this is Brian Terrell, which many of you all may know. He's probably been here to speak. He's a Catholic worker from Iowa. He and a group of friends were digging, maybe we should consider this here. We're digging a trench under the fence at the air base where nuclear weapons, U.S. nuclear weapons, are stored in the Netherlands. They were digging under, and then they ended up going over and getting arrested inside the fence line. So they've done that for 2 or 3 years in a row. The oldest European protest is at Buchel in Germany. And here's a picture of just a couple of folks that are blocking the air base, the German air base, where U.S. nuclear weapons are stored, blocking the fence line there. They do a lot of creative things. One year they had a symphony orchestra come and set up their orchestra right in front of the gates, and they played music for a while. And I guess the German guards liked it because they let them play quite a few tunes before they didn't arrest the tuba guy, but they showed him play. And so what else is going on in the world today? What other things can we be a part of? Well, September 17th in Washington, or in New York City, is going to hopefully be a very big march to to end fossil fuels. So if you're on the East Coast and can get to New York City on September 17th, the more people, the better. Were any of you at the last one, maybe 5 years ago, that we had in New York? And there were like 50,000 people that showed up for that. It's really important with global change, global everything that's happening now, that we show our concerns, and this is one of the ways. Another one is on the issue of wars and peacemaking. The Peace in Ukraine coalition, worldwide coalition, has called for actions between September 30th and October 8th, and to try to do something in your community to say, let's stop the killing, stop wars yet one more time. And then other things that are happening, our Veterans for Peace National Convention will be at the end of this month, August 25th, 27th. It again will be online. Ever since COVID happened, we've had online conventions, which actually have turned out very well. The recordings of all the panels have been excellent, and they're there for everyone to use, in your own community events. Our speakers are going to be Claire Daly, who is a Spitfire from Ireland. Boy, I tell you, if you want to hear somebody rip another one, this lady, she is good. In fact, Medea Benjamin and I were in Europe at the same time, and Claire invited us to go over to Ireland to speak on the issue of Irish neutrality, which of course the U.S. is trying to undercut, and we've been doing it throughout the Iraq War. The U.S. was sending U.S. combat troops in contract planes and landing in Shannon Airport and then sending them on to the Middle East. Well, so we've had a lot of people that have been arrested there saying this is, what the U.S. is doing is compromising your neutrality. And we've had 2 members of Veterans for Peace, Tarek Koff and Ken Mayers, who were arrested on the tarmac of the airport and ended up having their passports taken, and they got stuck in Ireland for like 9 months before their trial was held. But the bottom line is Claire and the Irish folks are good activists. Then, of course, we have Jeffrey Sachs, an economist that's been speaking a lot about wars, and Kathy Kelly, dear friend Kathy Kelly of Voices for Creative Nonviolence. So that's something that you can see online. Then the World Beyond War will be having its annual conference, again online, and that'll be in September 22nd, 24th. So there are a lot of things that are coming up that we would hope that you will find interesting and will tune in on, and having, getting groups together to maybe watch right here at Ground Zero, watch some of these things would be really useful, and then seeing what you can do here as we ask all the communities to do things. So these are some of the things that we've been working on. There are a lot of other issues. Of course, Kit and I were in Ireland together for the Gaza Freedom Flotilla, for solidarity with Palestine. We have a boat that's now going around Europe on a European tour, which will be educational events in 12 different ports in Europe. And then next year we'll be sending the boat on to the Mediterranean to physically challenge the Israeli blockade of Gaza. So there are a lot of issues that we have, and I know you all are concerned about these, and I hope this has given you a little look into some of the things that are going on around the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ann.
You're welcome.
We have time for some questions, if
Okay.
you're okay.
Sure.
Yeah, okay, yeah. Let's go ahead. So we have time for questions?
Okay, George.
Ann, thank you so much for that presentation. I've taken careful notes to take back to our Spokane group, but one of the frustrations I was going to ask you about is an activist friend of mine in Spokane says, we go to rallies, we go to conferences, and then the rally and the conference ends, this conference will end, and we all go home. And then what happens when we go home? Could you address that?
Sure. I think the things that we have to do with the information we gain from these conferences is put pressure on people that can actually affect the change. And so where are those pressure points? In general, they're with our U.S. Congress and our representatives that you all know in each one of your communities who your U.S. rep is and who your senator is, and trying to get to know them or know their key staffers and to be able to present the information that you feel is important on any of these subjects and mobilize community action when they have town halls, when they, when they're out and about, or flooding them with phone calls or emails, things like that, to try to affect change.
Well, just a follow-up, our group in Spokane has spoken with the staffs of U.S. Senator Maria Cantwell and U.S. Senator Patty Murray. They are not interested in the topics that we bring up.
Then vote them out of office.
Well, unfortunately, they're both entrenched.
Oh, I know, and that's our big problem, isn't it? That we have people that are entrenched, and how do they get entrenched? Because they get lots of donations from the military-industrial complex, from the big corporations that make money out of war, and they're unwilling to move their positions, their pro-war positions, because that's where they get their donations to run their campaigns. So, it's not like the American electoral system is a good one. I mean, we have lots and lots of problems with that, and trying to get good candidates to run for political office. I mean, I'd never do that. I mean, I don't want to be a part of that mess. But we got to find some people that will go ahead and do it and challenge them. And it may take a while, but...
These candidates normally lose.
Well, yeah, they lose until they win. So, you got to just keep after it. It's a system that we know is, I wouldn't say rigged, I mean, but in one way it is, because it's whoever gets the most donations usually gets the most publicity and the most this and the most that. But, I mean, that's where the decisions are made. And at the presidential level, we have a presidential election that'll be coming up, and depending on whether or not there are actual debates, which, that's another big challenge. What is happening to our system where candidates say, no, I don't think I'll debate, I don't want to talk about this. Well, we want you to talk about it. We want to know what your opinion is of this, that, or the other thing. So trying to do electoral work is really important, even though it's painful, but that's where the action is. We can sit out here as citizens and rail all we want to, but unless we get to the people that actually make the votes on the largest military budget in the history of the world, $880 billion, 10% more than last year, which at the time was the biggest military budget, and it just keeps going up and up and up and up. So it's not like there's a magic solution to it all. It's going to take a lot of hard work, a lot of pushing, and years to do it. If you look at what the right wing has done, it's been 30 years that they've been working to get people on school boards, that people that can run for political office, that have some backing. I mean, there is a reason why the tone of our Congress has changed, the tone of many school boards has changed. It's because there's been a concerted effort by a group of very well connected and rich people to fund elections that have gotten the people they want in. Now, we're not rich, but we can organize, and that's what we have to do. We can't just sit back and say, well, darn, how did they do that? Well, we can do that if we do it. Thank you. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, this movie Oppenheimer came out, got a lot of attention, and after that I read an essay by somebody had connections to the Manhattan Project and their grandfathers and that kind of thing. And they came out saying, well, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they were worth it because they stopped the war sooner. What's your response to that?
Bullshit. That's...
You got some good references to counter this.
Yeah, well, there are good references to the fact that within the government, they were saying, yeah, the war on Japan will be ending in about four weeks. That the pressure that has already been put on the Japanese government means that they are going to be ready to stop the wars. So there's that. There's data to that. If you look at the movie Oppenheimer, and if you actually read that book, which I have not done, but I've thumbed through it, it's about that big. And when you read parts of that, you know, the scientists themselves were saying, we don't want to make that moral decision. We are scientists making an object. What happens to the object is not our problem. And that's where Oppenheimer later went, well, actually it was our problem. And that's where Einstein, even in the movie, said, I don't want to have anything to do with that. We know what's going to happen. It's going to be terrible. So, you know, it's kind of...
a good reference for all that, 'cause I've heard.
Gwen
Yeah.
Dyer's book does it.
Yeah,
That's good.
well,
Gwen Dyer's book on war, I believe, gives all that history.
yeah, the history is out there, so...
Because some of that has been kind of suppressed. Yeah.
Well, yeah. Well, of course it's been suppressed. That's the nature of all of this, that they don't really want to publicize the fact that there were a lot of debates going on about whether to use this horrible weapon. And the debates continue to this day. I mean, why in the hell should we be having all of these nuclear weapons here? Well, because the debate is we may have to use them. We may have to use all of them to kill everybody on Earth. And it's like, well, that's a real moral decision. Thank you very much. You're going to eliminate the human race by this. And while we do have the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, which countries haven't signed it? All the ones that have the nuclear weapons. So all the great efforts of genuine, heartfelt people that don't want our collective humanity to be killed, all of this work, and yet we've got the 9 countries that say, tough noogies, we're going to keep them, and we may use them. And that's where this whole Ukraine thing and North Korea is so, you know, so dangerous, because at any moment one side may say, okay, let's just do a little tactical nuke somewhere, and all it is a nuke that's whatever, and the other side goes, okay, you did it, you did the first use, and we go next. Yeah, and then that next.
In your experience, what type of event or cause changes a person from a war sympathetic person to an anti-war person?
Well, and the question was, what may be a precipitating thing that may turn somebody that's been kind of pro-war into, let's not do the wars. I mean, I was in the government for 35 years. I wasn't necessarily pro-war, but I wasn't actively doing anything to stop any of it. For me, it was the pending war with Iraq, and knowing full well what the destruction was going to be in human lives and infrastructure was like, haven't we figured this thing out yet, that this doesn't work? You know, and I was 50 some odd years old at that point, and while many of you all at age 16, you'd already figured it out, and you were already out on the streets. I was a little bit of a slow learner, I guess, but you know, it depends on each individual person. I don't know, Tom, how about you?
I became disenchanted after the end of the Cold War in 1991, and I was still on active duty and at the submarine headquarters in Pearl Harbor, and watched the deployment of the Trident submarines not decrease after the end of the Cold War, but increase. And I asked the question, what's it going to take? And the answer was, well, as long as the Russians are capable, we've got to be more ready. And if they're desperate, we've got to be more ready. And yes, I called bullshit. And wasn't ever going to make admiral, and so was in a position where I could speak, not out in public, but certainly in Navy circles, about the insanity of the so-called promise of deterrence.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's see, the gentleman in the back.
Oh, Colonel Wright, I'm from Spokane also, that's Salish for Children of the Light. I'd like to congratulate you for walking with the women across the DMZ. I really enjoyed watching that a lot. Isn't it true that the U.S. was instrumental in even breaking up the Koreans being able to visit their relatives since then too? I thought I heard you mention that, but they can't even, they're dying and they can't even see them before they die now. Isn't that true?
Oh, absolutely, yeah, this travel ban means that Korean Americans cannot go to North Korea to see their families. Korean Germans can, because the German government does not have a travel prohibition. It's only the United States that has a travel prohibition. North Korea has been closed for the last 2 years because of COVID, but now it's opening up. So there will be a lot of families from other countries that will go, but our own Korean American families cannot go because of this travel ban. The other part of it is the missing in action. There are over 5,300 remains of U.S. service members that are identified. We know exactly the geographic location by coordinates of where bodies are. The North Koreans are willing to help these remains come back, but the U.S. has not been helpful in saying we want these remains back. So the MIA and the divided families issues are two of the key issues that we're working on.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I was wondering if you might be familiar with a man by the name of Ward Wilson. He's written several books. He's dedicated his life to the anti-nuclear piece. But he's coming out with a new book called It Is Possible. And when you were talking about the end of the war being, we won the war because of the bombs, he documents the information that has come out in other books, like the one Hiroshima-Nagasaki by Paul, on that really it was the emperor made up his mind because of the Russian declaration of war against them. And that's why the emperor decided to surrender. It had nothing to do with our bombs, because Japan had been bombed so many times, this is just another bomb. And so it's very interesting, and he comes out, I'm hoping that when his book comes out in September, that maybe we can sponsor a book discussion, and we'll try to make copies available. But his book is called It Is Possible, and I just didn't know if you might.
The book is called
It Is Possible.
And his name is?
Ward Wilson.
Ward Wilson.
Yeah, the
Thank
book
you.
will be coming out on September 26th, and he's got endorsements by, 10 Nobel Prize winners. I mean, he's just got a lot of important folks supporting the
Wonderful.
book.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you. Let's see, the gentleman in the back.
Yes, do you have any advice for working in communities like this one, or Oahu, or Washington State in general, that are so economically dependent upon the military to change opinions and attitudes?
Well, the question is, do we have any advice for communities where you have large military, the community is dependent on the military bases for employment and things like that? Well, yeah, it's that, well, for us on Oahu, sometimes it's a particular incident that gives you the opportunity to really mobilize community opinion. For us, it was in November of 2021 when all of a sudden 93,000 people, primarily on the military bases around Pearl Harbor, started smelling jet fuel coming up in their water, drinking water. And it turned out that 19,000 gallons of jet fuel had been spewed inside one of the tunnels for the 80-year-old massive underground fuel tanks that had been inside one of the mountains above Pearl Harbor for 80 years. 80 years these tanks were built during World War II, really engineering marvels, but they were 80 years old and they were leaking and had been leaking for decades. And there had been big spills before, but this one in November of 2021 was the one that we now have been able to use to get those tanks finally closed by a directive of the Secretary of Defense, not because he wanted to, but because there was such community outrage that we were able to mobilize first the civilian citizens of Honolulu, saying, you guys have now polluted our whole aquifer of Honolulu, and 93,000 of your own people in the military are now having to live in hotels in Waikiki because they can't stay at home because of all the water. We were able then to, the military families, of course, were, needless to say, disturbed by the fact that they were ending up in emergency rooms. I mean, we now have a whole group of military and civilians that were living on these bases that will have long-term toxic effects from jet fuel. And trying to help them with lawsuits against the U.S. military to get them on lists and registers, kind of like the Agent Orange. Other places like Camp Lejeune, where the toxic spills there 50 years ago, people are still suing about it. All of these things have given us an opportunity to rail against other parts of the militarization of Hawaii. Right now we have a situation where 27,000 acres of land that the military has used for the last 65 years. They got leases on this from the state of Hawaii 65 years ago, and for 27,000 acres they paid $1. $1 for a 65-year lease. We want the lands back. I say the universal we, the people of Hawaii, want those lands back, and so we're using all of this, the opportunity now that we have, that newspapers are covering challenges to the military. Whereas before the Red Hill spill happened, it was very difficult to get anything in the local newspapers or on TV. But now they are willing to cover virtually anything that we have. So sometimes it takes another tragedy, but right now you've got this Manchester, the Manchester fuel tanks that are dangers to your community, and trying to use that, use the Hawaii example, saying these things may do exactly to our community what it did to Oahu, so let's get these things done. And with the Secretary of Defense having ordered the fuel tanks in Hawaii to be closed and emptied, this is a great opportunity for you all to jump right on this and say, well, do the same thing for us. Thank you. Now, I don't know about timing.